At brunch, my granddaughter said in front of everyone, "She's not family. She's a tax deduction with a wig." I stayed silent, but when the accountant called them confused, they understood. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I sat there at Madison's perfectly set dining table, my coffee cup halfway to my lips, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. The silence that followed was deafening. Not one person at that table defended me. Not my son David, not my younger granddaughter Emma, not even Madison's mother who was visiting from Phoenix. Sophia, my 22-year-old granddaughter, just smirked and took another bite of her avocado toast as if she'd commented on the weather. The casual cruelty of it made my chest tighten. A tax deduction with a wig. The wig part stung the most. She knew exactly what she was doing when she said that. I set my cup down carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Everyone was still staring, waiting for my reaction. Madison cleared her throat and started talking about some charity event, trying to fill the awful silence. David picked up his phone and pretended to check messages. Coward. I excused myself to use the bathroom, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I needed a moment to breathe, to process what had just happened. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear the conversation resume behind me, as if my humiliation was just a minor interruption to their perfect Sunday brunch. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. In the bathroom, I stared at myself in Madison's ornate mirror. The wig was perfectly styled, a soft brown color that matched my natural hair before the chemotherapy took it away. I'd gotten so good at wearing it that sometimes I forgot it wasn't really mine. But Sophia's words reminded me that everyone else saw it for what it was, a fake covering for a woman who'd lost everything, including her dignity. The cancer had been brutal, but I'd beaten it. The doctors said I was a fighter, a survivor. Yet sitting in that bathroom, feeling the weight of my granddaughter's contempt, I wondered if surviving the disease had been easier than surviving my own family's indifference. I remembered the day I first put on this wig. It was 3 months after my last chemotherapy session, and David had insisted I come to dinner at their house. Madison had looked uncomfortable when she saw my bald head, even though it was covered with a soft scarf. The next week, she'd presented me with this expensive wig, saying it would make me feel more normal. I'd been grateful then. Now I realized it was never about making me feel better. It was about making them feel comfortable with my presence. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on to Sophia's spring break plans. Expensive plans, I noticed, probably funded by my son's credit card. Nobody acknowledged my return. It was as if I was invisible, just another piece of furniture in Madison's designer dining room. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I sat in a house I'd helped pay for, listening to plans funded by money that should have been mine, wearing a wig to hide the evidence of a battle I'd fought alone. During my treatment, David had been too busy with work to drive me to appointments. Madison had been too squeamish to help with my medication schedule. Even Emma, sweet as she was, had been uncomfortable around her sick grandmother. But Sophia had been the worst. She'd made comments about how the cancer was probably punishment for something I'd done wrong. She'd refused to visit me in the hospital, claiming my appearance made her uncomfortable. And now, sitting at this table, she had the audacity to reduce me to a tax benefit with fake hair. I finished my meal in silence, listening to them discuss their lives, their plans, their problems, none of which included me, except as an inconvenience to be managed. When Madison mentioned needing someone to watch the house while they went to Europe next month, David immediately volunteered my services without asking me. I was convenient that way. The conversation flowed around me like I was a stone in a stream. Emma talked about her college applications, and Madison worried about the cost. David assured her they'd figure it out, mentioning something about tax benefits. I caught Sophia's eye when he said it, and she gave me that same cruel smirk. As we prepared to leave, I overheard Madison whisper to her mother about how difficult it was having me in the house, how I took up space, how I needed special foods because of my dietary restrictions post-treatment, how I sometimes had bad days when the memories of being sick overwhelmed me. Her mother just nodded sympathetically, as if I were a stray cat they'd taken in out of obligation rather than love. Driving home in David's car, my car had been sold months ago to simplify things. I stared out the window and realized something had fundamentally shifted. The woman who'd raised this man, who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who'd sacrificed her retirement savings when his business struggled, no longer existed in his eyes. I was just what Sophia said, a tax deduction with a wig. That night, lying in the guest bedroom that had become my permanent residence, I stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that had led to this moment. 18 months ago, I'd been Eleanor Morrison, living in my own home, driving my own car, making my own decisions. Now I was Eleanor, the dependent, the burden, The woman who existed solely for other people's convenience and financial benefit. The wig felt heavy on my head as I finally drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow, I decided things were going to change. If they saw me as nothing more than a financial convenience, perhaps it was time they understood exactly what that meant. The accountant's call that would come later in the week would be just the beginning of their education about what happens when you mistake survival for weakness. The morning after that devastating brunch, I woke up in what used to be David's home office, now converted into my bedroom. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sleeping where his computer used to sit, where he'd once managed the finances of his struggling consulting business, the same business I'd saved by cashing out my retirement accounts 3 years ago. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying Sophia's words over and over. The cruelty of it still stung, but what hurt more was the silence that followed. Not one person had defended me. Not one person had said that was too far, even for Sophia's standards. As I got dressed, carefully adjusting my wig in the small mirror David had grudgingly hung on the wall, I thought about how I'd ended up here. It wasn't a sudden fall from grace. It had been a slow, methodical erosion of everything I'd built over 68 years of life. It started with the diagnosis. Stage 3 breast cancer, they said. Aggressive treatment needed immediately. I was living in my beautiful ranch house then. The one Henry and I had bought 30 years ago. The one we'd planned to grow old in together. After Henry died 5 years earlier, that house had been my sanctuary, filled with memories and the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain. But cancer changes everything. The treatments were brutal, and the medical bills started piling up despite my insurance. David began coming around more often, which I thought was out of concern. I was wrong. He was surveying the damage, calculating the cost. "Mom, you can't keep living alone like this," he'd said after my 3rd chemotherapy session, when I was weak and throwing up constantly. "What if something happens? What if you fall and no one finds you for days?" Madison had been there too, nodding sympathetically, but I caught her eyeing my antique furniture, the family heirlooms, the valuable artwork Henry and I had collected over the years. She was already mentally redecorating. "We have that guest room," David continued. "You could stay with us during treatment just until you get back on your feet." It seemed reasonable then. I was sick, scared, and exhausted from fighting both cancer and the isolation that came with it. My friends from the book club had gradually stopped visiting when my appearance became too stark a reminder of their own mortality. My sister lived across the country and had her own health problems, so I agreed to a temporary arrangement, just until I finished treatment. The first red flag should have been how quickly David suggested selling my house. "The market's hot right now, Mom. You could get top dollar. Think of it as liquidating an asset to pay for your care. We can put the money in a safe investment account." I was barely 3 months into chemotherapy, bald and weak, when the realtor signs went up. David handled everything. I was too sick to argue, too grateful for a roof over my head to question his motives. The house sold fast. My beautiful ranch with the garden I'd tended for decades. The kitchen where I'd hosted family dinners. The living room where Henry and I had spent quiet evenings reading together. Gone. David assured me the money was safely invested for my future care needs. That was 18 months ago. Now, as I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in this converted office, I realized I'd never seen a single statement from those investments. Whenever I asked, David would wave me off, saying he was handling everything, and I shouldn't worry about financial details while I was recovering. But I had recovered. My hair had grown back, though I still wore the wig because Madison said it looked more put together. My strength had returned. My regular scans showed no sign of cancer, yet here I was, still living in their guest room, still dependent on their charity, still being treated like an inconvenience rather than family. The real wake-up call had come 3 weeks ago, when I'd needed to go to the bank to get quarters for laundry. David wasn't available to drive me, and Madison had made it clear that borrowing her car was out of the question. "Insurance liability," she'd said with that fake apologetic smile. At the bank, I'd asked to check the balance on my savings account, the one where the money from my house sale was supposed to be invested. The teller had looked confused, checked her computer twice, then gently informed me that account had been closed 8 months ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Closed? What do you mean closed?" "The funds were transferred to another account," she explained, showing me the screen. Account holder David Morrison. It looks like he was listed as joint owner. Joint owner. I didn't remember signing papers making David a joint owner of my money. But then again, during chemotherapy, I'd signed a lot of documents I was too sick to read carefully. Powers of attorney, medical directives, what I thought were temporary arrangements to help David handle my affairs while I couldn't. That night at dinner, I'd confronted him about it. Madison was in the kitchen, supposedly cleaning up, but I could tell she was listening to every word. "David, I went to the bank today. They said my savings account is closed." He didn't even look up from his phone. Yeah, I moved the money to a better investment account. Higher returns. Without telling me, Mom, you asked me to handle your finances. That's what I'm doing. Trust me, this is better for you. I'd like to see the statements. I'll get them to you, he'd said. But that was 3 weeks ago, and I was still waiting. Madison had emerged from the kitchen then, drying her hands on a dish towel. Eleanor, David's been working so hard to make sure your money is safe. You should be grateful, not suspicious. Grateful. That word again. I was supposed to be grateful that my son had taken over my finances without my explicit consent. Grateful that I was living in a room barely big enough for a twin bed. Grateful that I had to ask permission to use the car that used to be mine. And now, after Sophia's comment about being a tax deduction, I was starting to understand why David had been so insistent about managing my money, why Madison kept detailed records of my expenses, why they made sure I was present at every family gathering even when it was clear I wasn't wanted. I wasn't their beloved mother and grandmother anymore. I was a business arrangement, a dependent they could claim on their taxes, a source of deductions and credits that helped offset their considerable expenses. Sophia's spring break trips, Emma's private school tuition, Madison's shopping sprees, their upcoming European vacation, all subsidized in part by the financial benefits of having me under their roof. The thought made me sick. I'd raised David to be better than this. I'd taught him values, integrity, the importance of family loyalty. But somewhere along the way, he'd learned different lessons. Maybe from Madison, maybe from the pressure of keeping up with their affluent lifestyle, maybe from simple greed. I thought about Henry then, about what he would say if he could see how his son was treating me. Henry had always worried that David was too focused on money, too impressed by material success. But even Henry wouldn't have imagined this level of betrayal. As I got ready for another day of being invisible in my own son's house, I made a decision. If they wanted to treat me like a business transaction, maybe it was time I started acting like one. Maybe it was time to show them that this old woman with the wig still had some fight left in her. The accountant would call later this week, just as they did every year around tax time. But this year, things were going to be different. This year, they were going to discover that their convenient little tax deduction had some surprises of her own. 3 days after the brunch incident, I was doing what I always did on Wednesday mornings, cleaning Madison's already spotless kitchen while she was at her yoga class. It wasn't expected of me exactly, but it had become part of my routine. A way to feel useful, to justify my presence in their home. I was wiping down the granite countertops when I heard Madison's phone buzzing on the kitchen island. She'd forgotten it again, something that happened more often than she'd like to admit. The screen lit up with a text notification, and I couldn't help but glance at it. The message was from her sister Karen. How's the tax situation this year? Still claiming Eleanor? My hand froze on the counter. Still claiming Eleanor. Like I was a recurring deduction, a line item they budgeted for each year. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that. But something compelled me to pick up the phone. Madison never locked it. She was trusting that way, or maybe just careless. The text thread was right there, and I found myself scrolling up to see the earlier messages. What I found made my blood run cold. Karen, doesn't Eleanor ever want to get her own place again? Madison, God, I hope not. Do you know how much we save on taxes with her here? Plus she watches the house when we travel. It's actually perfect. Karen, what if she finds out about the money situation? Madison, she won't. David handles all that. David. She's too trusting to ask the hard questions. Cancer really knocked the fight out of her. Cancer really knocked the fight out of her. I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. They weren't just using me financially. They thought I was broken, defeated, too weak to stand up for myself. I kept reading, my heart pounding harder with each message. Madison. Besides, where would she go? She has no money of her own anymore. Karen. What do you mean? Madison. David moved all her house money into investments tied to our accounts. She can't access it without going through him. And honestly, after what we've spent on her care, she probably owes us money at this point. My legs nearly gave out. I sank onto one of the kitchen stools, staring at the phone screen in disbelief. They had deliberately trapped me here. The investments David had mentioned weren't separate accounts for my benefit. They were tied to their finances, controlled by them. But there was more. Madison, the best part is she's so grateful to be here. She actually thanked me yesterday for letting her stay. It's almost too easy. Karen, what about the girls? Don't they ever complain about having grandma around? Madison, Emma's fine with it. Sophia thinks it's hilarious. She calls Eleanor our live-in tax break. Kids are so honest sometimes. Live-in tax break. That's what I was to them. Not grandmother, not family member, a live-in tax break. I heard Madison's car in the driveway and quickly put the phone back where I'd found it, my hands shaking. When she walked in, all yoga glow and expensive athleisure wear, I was back to wiping counters as if nothing had happened. "Oh, Eleanor, you don't have to clean," she said in that saccharine voice she used when she wanted to appear caring. "You're our guest." Guest. The word almost made me laugh. Guests don't live in converted offices for 18 months. Guests don't get asked to watch the house while the family goes on vacation. Guests don't get treated like unpaid help. "I don't mind," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "It gives me something to do." "Well, aren't you sweet?" Madison said, grabbing her phone and immediately checking her messages. Her face showed no concern that I might have seen anything. She truly believed I was too defeated, too grateful, too weak to be a threat. That afternoon, while Madison was out shopping and David was at work, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called a taxi. The driver looked concerned when he picked me up. I realized how I must appear, an elderly woman in a wig, getting into a cab from an expensive suburban house, clutching a worn purse like it contained all my worldly possessions, which, in many ways, it did. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked kindly. "The public library downtown," I said. "And please, take your time getting there." At the library, I found a computer and began researching. I looked up tax laws about claiming dependents, about financial elder abuse, about what constituted legitimate investment management versus theft. What I found was both encouraging and terrifying. If David had indeed moved my money into accounts I couldn't access without his permission, if he was using my dependency status for tax benefits while keeping me financially trapped, he could be in serious legal trouble. But proving it would require documentation I didn't have access to. I also researched local resources for seniors in financial distress. There were programs, advocates, legal aid societies. I wasn't as alone as I'd believed, but the most important thing I discovered was information about Social Security benefits and Medicare coverage that I'd been entitled to all along. Benefits that could potentially give me enough independence to live on my own again. Benefits that David had never mentioned during all his talk about managing my finances. I printed out several pages of information, folding them carefully and tucking them into my purse. Then I did something else I hadn't done in over a year. I went to a coffee shop. It was a small place near the library, the kind of neighborhood cafe I used to frequent before my diagnosis. I ordered a latte, a luxury I'd almost forgotten I could afford, and sat by the window, watching people walk by. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not Eleanor the patient, not Eleanor the dependent, not Eleanor the tax deduction. Just Eleanor, a woman who had survived cancer and deserved to live with dignity. That's when I saw her. Susan Martinez, my old friend from the book club. She was walking past the cafe, carrying a bag from the bookstore next door. Before I could lose my nerve, I knocked on the window. Susan's face lit up when she saw me. She rushed inside, and within minutes we were crying and hugging like long-lost sisters. "Eleanor! Oh my God, I've been worried sick about you. I called David's house so many times, but Madison always said you were sleeping or not feeling well enough for visitors. Not feeling well enough for visitors." Another lie. Madison had been screening my calls, isolating me from my friends. "I'm much better now," I said, and for the first time in months, it felt true. We talked for 2 hours. Susan filled me in on the book club, on mutual friends, on all the life I'd been missing. When I finally told her about my living situation, her expression grew increasingly concerned. "Eleanor, that doesn't sound right. You should be able to come and go as you please. You should have access to your own money." "I know," I said quietly. "I'm starting to figure that out." "Listen," Susan said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I have a friend who's a social worker specializing in elder issues. Would you like me to put you in touch with her?" I thought about Madison's text messages, about being called a live-in tax break, about the money from my house that I couldn't access. "Yes," I said firmly. "I would like that very much." When the taxi dropped me off at David's house that evening, I felt different. I had information now. Resources, a friend who cared about my well-being. I had the beginning of a plan. Madison was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I walked in. "There you are," she said. "David was looking for you earlier. He wanted to discuss some financial paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, my new knowledge making me braver. "Oh, just some investment stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." But I was worrying now. I was questioning everything. And soon, very soon, they were going to discover that this broken old woman in the wig had found her fight again. Meeting with Linda Rodriguez, the social worker Susan had recommended, was like stepping into a different world. Her office was warm and welcoming, filled with plants and family photos that reminded me of the life I used to have. Linda was younger than me, maybe 55, but her eyes held the kind of wisdom that comes from helping people navigate their darkest moments. "Tell me about your situation, Eleanor," she said gently, pouring me a cup of tea from a pot that smelled like chamomile and hope. I started slowly, but once I began talking, everything poured out. The cancer diagnosis, the gradual loss of my independence, the house sale I barely remembered agreeing to, the financial control David had assumed, and finally, the devastating discovery of Madison's text messages. Linda listened without judgment, taking notes occasionally, but mostly just giving me her full attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor, what you're describing sounds like financial exploitation of an elderly person. In some cases, it could be considered financial abuse." The word abuse hung in the air between us. I'd never thought of it that way. David was my son. Surely he wouldn't deliberately abuse me. "I know it's hard to accept," Linda said, reading my expression. "Family members are actually the most common perpetrators of elder financial abuse. They often justify it by telling themselves they're helping, or that they deserve compensation for caregiving, or that the money will eventually be theirs anyway. But what can I do? I don't even know where my money is." "We can find out. You have rights, Eleanor. You have the right to access your own financial information, to make your own decisions about where you live, to choose who you see and when. These rights don't disappear because you got sick or because you're living with family." Linda explained that there were legal ways to trace my money, to demand an accounting of how it had been managed, to reclaim control of my finances. She also told me about resources I hadn't known existed, programs that could help with housing, financial assistance for seniors, support groups for people in situations like mine. "The first step," she said, "is documenting everything. Do you have any paperwork from when you sold your house? Any bank statements or investment documents?" I shook my head. "David keeps all of that in his home office. I've never seen any statements." "Then we'll need to request them directly from the financial institutions. You have every right to see your own records." Over the next week, I met with Linda twice more. With her help, I called the bank where I'd originally deposited the money from my house sale. It took some time and several forms of identification, but they were able to trace the transactions. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. My house had sold for $485,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, there should have been about $420,000 left. David had initially deposited this money into a joint account with both our names on it, but over the following months, he'd systematically transferred funds out of that account. Some went to legitimate medical expenses, my chemotherapy, hospital bills, prescription costs, but the majority had gone elsewhere. $75,000 to pay off David and Madison's credit card debt, $50,000 for renovations to their kitchen and master bathroom, $35,000 for Sophia's first year of college at an expensive private university, $20,000 for their European vacation last summer. In total, over $280,000 of my money had been spent on their lifestyle, while I lived in their converted office and was grateful for the privilege. The remaining funds were in an investment account that required both signatures for any withdrawal. David had effectively trapped my own money so I couldn't access it without his permission. "This is theft," Linda said bluntly when I showed her the bank records. "I'm sorry to be so direct, but that's what this is." "What are my options?" I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. "You can file a police report for financial elder abuse. You can sue for the return of your money. You can demand that David provide a full accounting of how every penny was spent. The criminal case might be difficult to prove intent, but the civil case is much stronger." The thought of taking legal action against my own son made me feel sick. But then I remembered Sophia's cruel words, Madison's text messages calling me a live-in tax break, the way they'd all sat silent while my granddaughter humiliated me. "There's something else," Linda said carefully. "If you're being claimed as a dependent on their taxes while you're actually financially independent through your Social Security and pension, that's tax fraud. The IRS takes that very seriously. Tax fraud." I thought about all those years David had filed his taxes, claiming me as a dependent, getting deductions and credits for my presence in their home while spending my own money to subsidize their lifestyle. What would happen if the IRS found out? They'd audit the returns. David and Madison could face significant penalties, back taxes, and possibly criminal charges depending on how much money was involved. I sat in Linda's office, staring out the window at the busy street below. People were going about their normal lives, unaware that my entire world was reshaping itself around this new understanding of what my family had done to me. "I need to think about all this," I said finally. "Of course. But Eleanor, while you're thinking, I want you to consider something else. You don't have to stay in that house. You have options. Linda handed me a folder filled with information about senior living communities, affordable housing programs, and financial assistance for older adults. Many of the programs were specifically designed for people in my situation, those who'd lost housing due to health crises or family financial manipulation. One more thing, she said as I was leaving. I'd recommend opening your own bank account, one that only you control. Start having your Social Security and pension deposited there instead of into any account David manages. It's your money, and you have every right to control it. That afternoon, I did exactly that. I took another taxi to a different bank, one across town where David and Madison didn't have accounts. I opened a checking account in my name only and arranged for my Social Security and pension payments to be redirected there starting next month. For the first time in 18 months, I had my own money in my own account. It wasn't much, about $2,800 a month combined, but it was mine. And it was enough to live independently if I was careful. When I got home that evening, David was waiting for me in the living room looking agitated. Mom, where have you been? Madison said you've been taking taxis places. That's expensive and unnecessary. If you need to go somewhere, just ask. I went to see an old friend, I said, which was true enough. Which friend? Maybe we should have them over for dinner sometime. The suggestion was laughable. They'd isolated me from my friends for over a year, and now David wanted to play host? That's not necessary, I said. We met at a cafe. David frowned. Mom, I've been thinking. All these trips out, the taxi rides, maybe it's time we discussed your financial situation more seriously. Your medical expenses have been significant, and we need to be more careful about unnecessary spending. Unnecessary spending. He was lecturing me about unnecessary spending while living in a kitchen renovated with my money, planning another vacation funded by my house sale. What did you want to discuss? I asked, curious to see how deep his deception would go. Well, your care costs more than your Social Security covers. We've been subsidizing your living expenses out of our own pocket. I think we need to set up a more formal arrangement. A formal arrangement. He wanted me to start paying rent to live in the office of the house my money had helped renovate, while he controlled the rest of my assets. I see, I said calmly. What kind of arrangement? Maybe $1,500 a month for room and board. That would cover your fair share of housing costs and food. $1,500. More than half of my monthly income, which would leave me completely dependent on his generosity for anything beyond basic survival. I'll think about it, I said, and I saw relief flash across his face. He thought I was still the broken, grateful woman who would accept whatever he decided was fair. But that woman was disappearing. In her place was someone who'd spent the day learning about her rights, opening her own bank account, and planning her escape from this beautiful prison. Oh, and Mom, David said as I headed toward my room, the accountant will be calling this week to go over tax stuff. It's just routine, but I'll handle the call. I'll handle the call. Of course he would. He couldn't risk me talking to the accountant directly. Couldn't risk me learning exactly how much money they'd saved by claiming me as a dependent while spending my own funds. Actually, I said, turning back to face him, I'd like to talk to the accountant myself this year. I want to understand my tax situation better. The color drained from David's face. That's not necessary, Mom. I've been handling your taxes for years. Why complicate things? It's not complicated, I said with a smile that I hoped looked innocent. I'm just curious about my financial picture. That night, as I lay in the narrow bed in their converted office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. The accountant would call, and this time I would be ready with questions. Questions that would finally reveal the full scope of what they'd done to me. And then finally, it would be time for them to learn that their convenient little tax deduction had some very inconvenient surprises in store. The accountant called on a Thursday morning while Madison was at her weekly tennis lesson and David was at work. I'd been waiting by the phone for 3 days, having quietly informed Linda Rodriguez that I expected the call and wanted to handle it myself. Good morning. This is Robert Chen from Chen & Associates. I'm calling to discuss some questions about the Morrison family tax return. May I speak with David Morrison? This is Eleanor Morrison, David's mother, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. David mentioned you might be calling about tax matters. Perhaps I can help you. There was a pause. Well, Mrs. Morrison, I actually have some questions specifically about your tax status. David usually handles these calls, but since you're here, I'm happy to answer any questions about my own taxes. Mr. Chen. Excellent. I'm looking at the dependent exemption claimed for you on the Morrison family return, and I have some concerns about the documentation. According to my records, you receive Social Security benefits and a pension that total approximately $2,800 per month. Is that correct? My heart began to pound. Yes, that sounds right. And you're living with your son and daughter-in-law full-time? Yes. The issue is, Mrs. Morrison, that to claim someone as a dependent, they must either earn less than $4,300 per year or be permanently disabled. Your income appears to exceed that threshold significantly. I felt a flush of validation mixed with anger. I see. And what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that technically you shouldn't be claimed as a dependent on their tax return. You're financially independent. In fact, you should probably be filing your own tax return and claiming your own exemptions. My own tax return? I tried to sound confused rather than triumphant. But David has always handled my taxes. He said it was simpler to include me on his return since I live here. I understand the confusion, but that's not how tax law works. If you're not truly dependent on them for financial support, claiming you as a dependent is problematic. Problematic. That was a polite way of saying fraudulent. Mr. Chen, I have to admit I'm a bit confused about my overall financial situation. Could you help me understand what I should be doing? Of course. First, you should definitely be filing your own tax return. You're entitled to your own standard deduction, and depending on your medical expenses and other factors, you might be due some significant refunds for previous years. Previous years? Well, if you've been incorrectly claimed as a dependent for multiple years and you should have been filing independently, the IRS allows you to amend returns going back 3 years. Given your income level and age, you could be looking at substantial refunds. I gripped the phone tighter. Not only had David been committing tax fraud by claiming me as a dependent, but I'd been missing out on thousands of dollars in refunds that should have been mine. There's something else, Mr. Chen continued, and I could hear papers rustling. I see some large deductions claimed for your medical expenses and care costs. Do you have records of these expenses? David handles all of that paperwork. What kind of expenses are we talking about? According to the return, they've claimed approximately $45,000 in medical and care-related expenses for you over the past 2 years. That would include things like medical equipment, home modifications for accessibility, professional care services, specialized transportation, those sorts of things. $45,000. I'd never seen a single piece of medical equipment beyond the basic hospital bed they'd briefly rented after my surgery. There had been no home modifications, no professional care services, no specialized transportation. Mr. Chen, I said carefully, I think there might be some confusion about those expenses. I haven't needed most of those services. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Morrison, do you have someone who can help you review your tax situation? A financial advisor or perhaps another family member? Actually, I've been working with a social worker about my finances. Would it be appropriate for her to contact you? Absolutely. In fact, I think that would be advisable. There are some significant discrepancies here that need to be addressed. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen trembling. Not from fear, but from the intoxicating rush of finally understanding the full scope of what had been done to me. David and Madison hadn't just stolen my money and isolated me from my friends. They'd been committing tax fraud, claiming expenses that didn't exist, taking deductions they weren't entitled to, and now the accountant knew. I called Linda immediately and explained the conversation. She was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Eleanor, this is worse than we thought. If they've been claiming false medical expenses and an improper dependent exemption, we're talking about serious tax fraud. The penalties alone could be devastating for them. What happens now? I think we need to accelerate your timeline for getting out of that house. Once David realizes what the accountant knows, he's going to panic. People in panic do unpredictable things. That afternoon, Linda helped me look at a one-bedroom apartment in a senior community about 20 minutes from David's house. It was small but bright, with a kitchenette, a bathroom with safety bars, and a living area with large windows that faced a courtyard garden. The best part was the price. $1,200 a month. Utilities included. With my Social Security and pension, I could afford it comfortably and still have money left over for groceries, transportation, and the small luxuries I'd been denied for the past 18 months. I'd like to put down a deposit, I told the rental manager, surprising myself with how quickly I'd made the decision. Wonderful. We can have you moved in within a week if you'd like. A week. In a week, I could be living independently again, free from their control, their contempt, their constant reminders that I was a burden they graciously tolerated. That evening, David came home earlier than usual, his face tense with worry. Madison was right behind him, and they both looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Mom, we need to talk, David said, settling into the chair across from me in their living room. Robert Chen called me this afternoon. He said he'd spoken with you about tax matters. Yes, he had some questions about my status. You shouldn't have answered those questions without me present. Tax matters are complicated, and you might have said something that could cause problems. I looked at him steadily. What kind of problems? Madison jumped in, her voice higher than usual. Eleanor, David's been protecting you from all the boring financial details. But sometimes when people don't understand the big picture, they can accidentally say things that get misinterpreted. What did I misinterpret? David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he'd been caught in a lie. Look, Mom, the important thing is that we're family. We take care of each other. The specific details of how that works with taxes and finances, that's not something you need to worry about. But I am worried about it, I said calmly. Mr. Chen suggested I should be filing my own tax return. That sounds like something I should understand. The look that passed between David and Madison was panic, pure and simple. That's ridiculous, Madison said quickly. You don't have enough income to require filing taxes. David's been handling everything properly. Actually, I said, pulling out the folder Linda had given me, I've been learning quite a bit about my financial situation lately. Did you know that with my Social Security and pension, I'm actually above the threshold for filing requirements? I should have been filing my own returns all along. David's face went white. Mom, where are you getting this information? Someone's been filling your head with nonsense. I've been working with a social worker who specializes in elder financial issues. She's been very helpful in explaining my rights. A social worker? Madison's voice was sharp now. Eleanor, that's completely unnecessary. We're your family. We're taking care of you. I know you are, I said with a smile that I hoped looked grateful. In fact, I've been thinking about our living arrangement. David mentioned setting up a more formal financial arrangement, and I think that's a good idea. Relief flooded both their faces. They thought I was capitulating, accepting their plan to charge me rent while keeping control of my assets. I've found a lovely apartment in a senior community, I continued. I'll be moving there next week. The silence that followed was deafening. David's mouth actually fell open. Madison looked like she'd been slapped. Moving? David finally managed. Mom, that's not necessary. We can work out the financial arrangement here. You don't need to move. I want to, I said simply. I miss my independence. And this way, you won't have to worry about the tax complications of having me as a dependent anymore. The word dependent hung in the air like a sword. David and Madison both understood exactly what I was implying. We need to discuss this as a family, Madison said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Of course, I agreed. But my mind is made up. I'll be moving out Monday morning. That night, I could hear them arguing in their bedroom, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the converted office. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught enough. Audit, investigation, serious trouble. They were finally beginning to understand that their convenient little tax deduction was about to become their biggest nightmare. And I was just getting started. Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that makes new beginnings feel possible. I'd hired a small moving company to help with the few belongings I was taking, mostly clothes and personal items. Everything else in that house belonged to David and Madison anyway. Purchased with my money but never truly mine. Linda arrived early to help coordinate everything. She'd become more than just a social worker to me. She was the friend who'd helped me find my voice again. How are you feeling? She asked as we watched the movers load my boxes into their truck. Free, I said, and meant it. David and Madison had barely spoken to me since I'd announced my move. They'd tried everything. Guilt, anger, false concern about my ability to live alone. But their panic was showing. Yesterday, David had actually suggested that maybe we should revisit the whole tax situation with a different accountant. Too late for that. As the moving truck pulled away from the house where I'd spent 18 months as a prisoner of family loyalty, I felt my phone buzz. A text from Sophia. Heard you're moving out. Good luck with that. Even now, she couldn't resist one last cruelty. But her words didn't sting anymore. I had something she'd never understand. The strength that comes from surviving both cancer and family betrayal. My new apartment was perfect. Small, yes, but every inch of it was mine. I spent the first day arranging my few possessions and marveling at the silence. No Madison making passive-aggressive comments about my presence. No David treating me like a financial burden. No Sophia's casual cruelty. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I removed my wig. My real hair had grown back during the months of recovery, silver white and shorter than before, but healthy and strong. I'd kept wearing the wig because Madison had insisted it looked more appropriate, because it maintained the illusion that I was still the woman I'd been before cancer changed everything. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone new, someone stronger. I looked at myself in my bathroom mirror. Really looked. The face staring back at me was older, marked by illness and betrayal, but the eyes were clear and determined. This was Eleanor Morrison, cancer survivor, financial abuse survivor, woman who'd finally learned to choose herself. The phone rang around 7 o'clock, David's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Mom, we need to talk, do we? The accountant called. There are going to be some complications with our tax situation. He thinks there might need to be an audit. I let the silence stretch. Let him squirm. Mom, maybe if you moved back home, we could work this out. Explain to the IRS that it was just a misunderstanding. David, I said calmly, I am home. That apartment isn't your home. Your home is with family. My family, I said, called me a tax deduction with a wig. My family stole my money and isolated me from my friends. My family made me feel grateful for sleeping in a converted office while they lived off my life savings. That's not, we were taking care of you. No, you were using me. There's a difference. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more desperate. What do you want from us? It was a good question. Revenge would have been satisfying, but I'd learned something important over the past few weeks. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's liberation. I want my money back, I said simply. Every penny you took that wasn't legitimately spent on my medical care, I want it transferred to my account within 30 days. Mom, we don't have that kind of cash available right now. Then you'll need to figure it out. Sell something. Take out a loan. That's not my problem anymore. And if we do that, then I won't pursue criminal charges for financial elder abuse. The IRS audit is out of my hands. That's between you and them now. But I won't actively assist in any investigation if you make this right. I could hear him talking to Madison in the background. Urgent whispered conversations about liquidating assets and borrowing against equity. We'll need time to arrange everything. 30 days, David, not 31. 2 weeks later, Susan from my book club called with news that made me smile. Eleanor, you'll never guess what I heard at the grocery store. Madison Morrison was there crying on her phone about having to sell her jewelry and cancel their vacation. Apparently, they're having some kind of financial crisis. I felt a small flicker of satisfaction but pushed it down. This wasn't about watching them suffer. It was about reclaiming what was mine. The money arrived in my account on day 28. Not all of it, but close enough. David had liquidated Madison's jewelry collection, canceled their European vacation, and taken out a second mortgage on the house I'd helped renovate. Along with the transfer came a brief note. I'm sorry, Mom. I hope someday you can forgive us. I read it twice, then filed it away. Forgiveness might come eventually, but it would be on my terms, in my time. That afternoon, I went to a salon in my new neighborhood. A real salon, not the budget place where I'd been getting my wig maintained. I'd like a proper haircut, I told the stylist, a young woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. Should I work around your wig? She asked. I reached up and removed it, setting it on the counter beside her tools. I won't be needing this anymore. She smiled. Your natural hair is beautiful. Let's give it a style that shows it off. An hour later, I looked in the mirror and saw myself, really myself, for the first time in 2 years. My silver hair was cut in a soft, flattering style that framed my face. I looked like a woman who'd survived something terrible and emerged stronger. I walked out of that salon with my head held high, the wig left behind like a shell I'd finally outgrown. 3 months later, I was settled into my new life completely. I'd rejoined the book club, made new friends in my building, and even started volunteering at a local organization that helped seniors navigate financial abuse. David called occasionally, awkward conversations where we both pretended things might eventually return to normal. Madison never called at all. Sophia had graduated college, with student loans this time, since the family tax benefits were no longer available to help with tuition. Emma, my younger granddaughter, surprised me by visiting one Sunday afternoon. She was 18 now, preparing for her own college journey. Grandma, she said, studying my face carefully. You look different. Different how? Happy, she said simply. You look happy. I was happy, not despite what my family had done to me, but because I'd found the strength to save myself from it. As Eleanor Morrison, the woman who removed her wig and reclaimed her life, I'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the family that betrays you gives you the greatest gift possible, the motivation to finally choose yourself.